So before I say anything, I apologize. I seem to have caught a cold before I walked in here, and it only got worse. As the afternoon went on, I think what did me in was the Canadian and Australian presentations from the previous panel, where I just got increasingly depressed in my chair as I heard about all the robust changes that those two countries were implementing. And then the coup de grace was that chart that you showed with the two little things that the United States had done, though it's not entirely true, as I shall discuss a little bit. So if I cough or wheeze, I apologize ahead of time. So my remarks are going to be kind of in the way of reactions to various points and ideas that came up in the previous presentations. Take them for what they're worth. Most of them are my own opinions. Some of them are DHS opinions. So you may be able to figure out which ones are which. If I say something that's not exactly party line, then it's me, not DHS. Though if I don't come to tomorrow's panel, then you know that I was eliminated or something for having spoken wrongly. So first, with respect to the descriptions of the Canadian system and of the differences between the US and Canada. First, yes, the rapidity and I think as one of the questioners said earlier, the nimbleness with which the Canadians and the Australians in particular are able to change their systems, more so the Canadians, is, as H.G. Wells put it in the context of the Martians looking at Earth, regarded with envious eyes by us in, especially at the Department of Homeland Security. There's it's always very frustrating to me when I go to like an international event, like at the OECD or a conference like this, and I don't have much to show, you know, on our side of the coin. But that's just the way our system is. I think, though, as recent news indicates, we aren't entirely powerless to make at least some sorts of administrative reforms around the edges of our system, though not too much. Still, we may see in the coming months a few changes that could help improve things a bit. The one idea. Well, let me turn to one of the other comments that was made was regarding the I guess the different ways that Canada allows immigrants to come in, and there was discussion of how you have a federal program, much like the United States does, but then there's also a provincial level immigration program, and we don't have that here. In fact, we just went through an infamous Supreme Court fight over the question of to what degree states can intervene in immigration law, and in which the state of Arizona lost for the most part. But it's an interesting question. I know that not so many years ago, we at DHS received inquiries from a few Western states, which shall not be named, asking us, would it be possible for them to set up their own private temporary worker programs? They were fed up with the slowness and inefficiency of the existing temporary worker programs, especially for agricultural workers. And they asked us, we have this whole system ready to go. We're going to set up the whole thing. We're going to recruit the workers. We're going to get the employers all lined up. We're going to enforce it. We're going to give them all identity cards. We're going to make sure they live in proper housing. We're going to do the whole thing. And we'll even make sure they leave. All you have to do, DHS, is just let them in. And so in one of the states, in fact, wrote up a whole state law to that effect, which they were poised to pass, all contingent on DHS's cooperation with letting the workers in. For those who are immigration wonks, what they wanted us to do is parole them all in. Something in the order of 50, 60,000 workers, and just parole them in. And the secretary at that time, was Secretary Chertoff, said no. And that was the end of that. But it was an interesting proposal. We'd never seen anything like that before. And we got 2 or 3 of them from totally different states which weren't working in tandem. And it was an interesting idea. And I don't know if in the current round of administrative reforms that are being contemplated, if any of those states tried that again. I haven't seen it on my desk, but uh, it, it's an interesting idea. I don't think personally it'll ever happen here, given especially what we just went through in the Supreme Court. But it is a novel concept. Um, there are some things which we could possibly let the states do, but certainly not set up their own private, immigration programs. That I don't think would work. Um, Other things that were discussed. There was, I guess, the whole issue of how I think you, Professor Zavani, were talking about how in Canada the immigrants are, on the whole, much better educated than the immigrant pool in the United States. And to be sure, that's right. And as and one reason for that, of course, is, as I think was also discussed, was that we have totally inverse streams of immigrants. We have mostly family-based, and Canada has mostly employment-based. So naturally, the employment-based immigrants will be educated for whatever occupation they're coming to fill. Family-based immigrants don't need to have any education at all. Many don't, but some do. Many of our family-based immigrants, in fact, have high levels of education, and our family-based immigrants, it's multiple hundreds of thousands a year. Out of the 1 million immigrants we get, probably 700,000 or 800,000 are family-based. Many of them, to be sure, are also very highly educated, but they show up without the benefit of any job offer or any of the other systematic assistance that the employment-based immigrants have. So I know I and a number of other like-minded colleagues have long thought that we need to address that problem a little better than we do now. We don't do much now about those, about highly skilled immigrants coming in the family pool, in the family stream. There are a number of organizations, associations, entities that have worked on the integration issues, and particularly the OECD. And there are many good ideas about how to get at that problem. We haven't done it yet, not well, at least, in my opinion. I was heartened to see in the legislation that the Senate passed last year on immigration that there was, for the first time I'd ever seen in immigration laws, a whole section devoted to integration issues. It was very small, but it was a good sign, because I think it's something that's missing. And though you wouldn't think it immediately, it does directly relate to the efficiency of our immigration system and bringing people in integrating highly skilled immigrants. Other points that came up. I think Professor Beach mentioned one of his challenges was what fraction of the employment-based immigrants should a country have? How you divide, what proportion should be skilled and what proportion should be unskilled? And this is an issue that is, that has bedeviled us in the States for a long time. Right now, I don't have the law in front of me, but off the top of my head, I recall that the number of slots for immigrant visas, for green cards that we have for low skill or no skill people, I think is maxed out at 5,000. And the rest of the 140,000, that very tiny number to be sure, is for everybody else, the people with degrees and PhDs and all that. But we only have 5,000 slots for the low skill or no skill, and by no means is that ever used up. In fact, I don't think we've ever hit that number. Part of the problem is, well, I'll leave that aside, but one of the problems that we're going to have to face if comprehensive immigration reform ever comes back again would be, do we increase that number? Do we provide more opportunities for people of low skill to get green cards? I know that this is an issue that is very important to the agricultural community in particular. We have a lot of people that, if comprehensive immigration reform were to ever happen, would be coming over to do agricultural work. They certainly would not qualify for any of the employment-based visa categories that we have now. But if we do not provide them with an avenue to get a green card, then they would never be able to stay permanently, and you would end up with a permanent cycle of temporary agricultural workers forever. As a matter of national policy, it's not clear to me that we want that, but that's something that we need to focus on. So the challenge is indeed a valid one. The One of Professor Beach's recommendations was that we in the States and all of us should monitor very closely um, the program that Canada is implementing on the expansion of interest model. I think it is very much worth looking at carefully. I think, though, that even if it goes very well, it'll be hard to draw lessons in our country, given the nature of the way we make our immigration laws, to adopt something as radical as that for U.S. purposes into our system. But it is important, and we need to look at that and see how that works. I think that if comprehensive reform ever comes back, there may be room for more creative thought, even more creative than what was put into the last bill. With every month that goes by, all of us learn new things, and the people on the Hill learn new things, and it's very likely that there could be some more interesting elements of whatever bill comes up in the future, should another one come along. I would say that in general, when it comes to learning lessons from other countries and foreign models, foreign immigration models, we in the States have kind of a bad record. I know that we see with interest, what other countries are doing, and when we develop our policy, we take it into account. But it is again, because of the nature of our legislative process, very hard to implement more radical change or the types of change that some of us might want to implement. But sometimes, I wrote a few notes here, we have been able to take some lessons and apply them. I know, I remember, for example, the Australian example with the Australian experience rather with foreign students, and I think there was a period in time where Australia let anybody with a master's degree or PhD, I'm not sure what it was, get lawful permanent residence, or effectively something like that. And this was at a time about 4 or 5 years ago where there was a lot of bills flying around that would give anybody with a STEM degree a green card. And they were very sloppily drafted. They were very quickly written. Basically anybody who has a STEM degree gets a green card. And I remember going to one of these conferences and seeing an Australian colleague, and I told her, "Hey, did you see our new bill? You see, we're trying. We're trying to attract more STEM educated people." And she looked at the language that I proffered, and she said, "Oh no, you can't do that. That's exactly what we did. That'll just mess everything up, and you'll end up with physicists driving taxi cabs." And I said, "What?" And then she pointed out, and I brought it back home to the States, and I considered it a little more, and sure enough, she was right. Amongst us, people who worked in policy ideas, we talked about this, and we decided that surely wouldn't do. And since that time, I've noticed that the bills in question have always been very careful to plug that hole that would have let fraud schools or sham schools pop up to become visa mills to get people green cards. Other examples of things that we've seen in foreign countries that have influenced our policymaking, the existence of the MAC itself. Before a few years ago, there was no real model that we had here of how how anything like the MAC would work or carry out any sort of mission like that. There has been a lot of talk for some years here in the States of setting up some sort of commission that would either set the caps on immigrant visa categories, or would perhaps even set the wage levels. Or it wasn't clear what we wanted, but there was some idea that we needed an impartial third entity, not Congress, not the bureaucrats in the executive branch, but some third impartial entity that would help bring more rationality to the process. And until the MAC came along, we had no idea what such a thing would look like, and now we see it. And I saw that in the bill that passed the Senate last year, there was an attempt to create a similar commission here, though I don't think it was very well fleshed out, but still there was an attempt. And I don't think we would have done that or even tried it had we not seen that example. Um, the Another example. Here's some examples where we actually haven't done anything really yet. The Canadian government, I think it was discussed in the first panel, recently implemented a number of changes, tightening and cracking down somewhat on the intercompany transferee category and on some of the other related categories in the wake of the a number of incidents over the past couple of years that brought those programs into the national spotlight. We in the States are aware of what they've done, and we've considered it, but we haven't done anything yet on our own. Again, because much of the things that they have done would require legislation on our side. But still, we have taken note of what they've done, and we're following with keen interest what the results are of their work in that field. Similarly, we noted that Canada shut down their investor visa program. And they replaced it with I guess, for lack of a better term, a startup visa program of sorts. But our investor visa program has for a long time been the subject of much debate and discussion as to whether it should continue in the way that it has so far. But we have also noted that with keen interest. We also noted that the MAC itself, a few months ago, published a report on investor visa programs in the UK, which amongst much else suggested increasing the investment amounts and gave a very well-reasoned explanation for why that should be done. We read that too with keen interest. We still haven't done anything on our side, but we're not unaware of what the other countries are doing. It's just that it's difficult for us to implement things like that as quickly. Let me think here. Final point. The final 2 points. With respect to temporary visas, there was a chart, Professor Zavani, in your presentation where you showed how the number of the types of people that were coming over on temporary visas in Canada were usually were not as highly skilled as the types of people that were coming over in the States. That's certainly true. I think that part of the reason, of course, is that the H-2A and the H-2B programs, which are the programs for temporary and seasonal workers in the United States, are in the case of H-2B, capped at a very low level relative to what we're told market need is. And in the H-2A program for agricultural workers, it's greatly underused for a number of reasons. But that could change if there were legislative reform that addressed those two programs in particular, or replaced them with a program that actually was workable and easy to use by employers. Why those numbers could flip completely, and your chart might look very different. Interestingly, right now in the H-2A and the H-2B programs, these temporary seasonal programs for agricultural and non-agricultural workers, well over 90% of the people that we're getting are from Mexico, but for obvious reasons. But were those programs to be substantially reformed in a way that made them more attractive to employers here and to workers from all over the world, not just Mexico, we could see a whole different profile of people coming to work in those programs. Right now, for example, no people from China or India come, one or zero people come from China or India in those programs, and for many years back that has been the case. That could change. Geography is not necessarily a limiting factor. Every year we get a huge number of people from Nepal coming to work in the H-2B program, I think it is. It all depends on international recruitment channels, and they just don't exist yet for large parts of the world, but all that could change. And finally, with respect to things that the United States has done in recent years, there were a few other things besides the two things that we saw. We saw on the chart that the United States has proposed letting the spouses of certain professional workers work. For the immigration wonks in the room, it's the H-1B category, and we've proposed to let the spouses of some of them work, specifically the ones who have manifest their intention to immigrate here, to get green cards. That is in, that regulation should be finalized in a few months. Other things we've done, there was another regulation that came out around the same time that proposed letting the spouses of foreign students study. Incredibly, heretofore, they have not been allowed to study. They had to go get their own student visa to be able to study. But we proposed to allow the spouses of foreign students to study at least part-time, but not to work, but to study part-time. And then if we go back just a few years, if we go back to 2008, there was a seminal regulation we came out with at that time that permitted foreign students who normally get 1 year after they graduate to continue working for another 17 months, but only if they had a degree in a STEM field. So that's been out now for 5 years and has attracted somewhere in the order of 10,000 or so people a year. And also in 2008, we published a regulation that extended the period of time that Canadian NAFTA workers can be here from 1 year to 3 years. It used to be that they could only stay for up to a year, then they had to go back and come back again. This regulation allowed them to stay up to 3 years. Those are just a few of the small things in recent years. Those are my comments for now.
Thank you. Well, the speakers have spoken. Now it's the turn for the audience to ask questions.